So the perspective that Cody and I and Nir have adopted in this project about BCIs is partly informed by the extended mind theory. The idea that when we started learning how to express our thoughts onto paper or papyrus and then re-upload them again later, that was the beginning of the process of the externalization of cognition. And that the number of digital affordances that we have now are now participating in our cognition in a way that means that we can think about the questions of the mind, not just in terms of the brain, but also these larger contexts. So start with the fact that I think BCIs are already part of the public consciousness. Pew has been doing surveys about BCIs for the last 10 years. They find that the majority of Americans are squicked out by the idea, not enthusiastic, but that they see the logic of therapeutic applications. So here, allowing increased movement for people who are paralyzed, 77% agree, treat age-related mental decline, 64% agree. But when you get down to translating thoughts into text or searching the internet by thinking alone, then people, only about a third, a quarter of Americans, this was 10 years ago, this one's more recent, this is 2022. Majority of Americans say widespread use of brain chips to improve cognitive function would be bad for society. So 56% say bad, only 13% say good. So the idea of cognitive enhancement is not popular, but the idea of therapeutic applications is popular. And then the things that could design features that could make people more sympathetic towards BCIs is if you can turn on and off the effects. I don't know why we wouldn't want to do that in the first place, but and also if it could be put in place for surgery. So non-invasive BCIs being less problematic for people than invasive BCIs. But the general point here is that there is an implicit awareness of BCIs in popular culture already, and that people are beginning to respond to them. So, by the way, I found this fantastic quote from 1960. This is Licklider. The hope is that in not too many years, human brains and computing machines will be coupled together very tightly, and the resulting partnership will think as no human brain has ever thought and processed data in a way not approached by the information handling machines we know today. So, as I said, I think probably ubiquitous BCIs are in the future. I assume that that's the case. And that in some ways, the ethical questions that they raise are boring in the sense that I think it should be obvious that they should be tested to be safe and effective. We should understand what their consequences are when they're installed. So any regime of laissez-faire implantation of BCIs would be bad. That they're ancient in terms of the extended mind thesis that BCIs are the kind of end result of a process that started with literacy, the building up of our extended mind and exocortex, but that they may be novel in certain ways in that they challenge aspects of our selfing, our sense of identity that are not novel in ways that books and cell phones have not challenged. And my thesis is that we can examine the way that science fiction and popular culture have depicted BCIs, not so much as an actual examination of the ethical and policy challenges of BCIs, but to understand how the modernity and this the fracturing and the erosion of self that's occurring because of our growing electronic embeddedness, how that reflects in our anxieties about modernity. So one great example is Michael Crichton, who I'm not a huge fan of because he's, Nir and I constantly argue about Black Mirror, but Michael Crichton was the first Black Mirror. He never met a technology that didn't elicit some kind of horrific techno thriller trope on his part. And this was his first novel, I think, and apparently his least favorite, but it was written in 1973, I think, 1972, when the movie came out in 74. And it was based on early experiments on trying to short circuit seizures by putting electrodes into presumably rodent brains at the time, but they were extrapolating that they could do this with humans. So there was a feedback loop, there was the detection of the epilepsy, and then the application of electric shock in the brain to short circuit the epilepsy. And it turned out that the electrical shocks were pleasurable. They stimulated some pleasure in the brain. So the guy who got this got addicted to it, and he started getting himself to seizure all the time, and that made him insane and then homicidal. So this wasn't the first time popular culture had addressed this, but this was probably the most popular and dramatic version of this. Something that people have been talking about in science fiction and futurism for a while, wireheading, the notion that, as you see with this famous mouse experiment, if you put a direct pleasure sensor into a pleasure stimulator into a mouse's brain, and they have a choice between food and pleasure, at least apocryphally, the mouse will starve itself by hitting the pleasure center and never eat it with food. And so this kind of wireheading is obviously something we don't want to have happen with brain-computer interfaces. But is this so much indicative of people worrying about the fact that people might do this with BCIs, or is it more about our general concern about dopamine addiction, which is now just a very common phrase? I mean, we see dopamine addiction all around us in every behavior that we do, the need for social media detoxes and the dopamine loops that different kinds of social media get us into. So I see this more as a general concern about dopamine addiction, but certainly Michael Crichton got there first in terms of the potential risks. Black Mirror, I'm going to talk about 3 different Black Mirror episodes. Again, Black Mirror, not my favorite because it's uniformly techno-pessimistic, but it does do a lot about brain-computer interfaces. And the episode, The Entire History of You, starts with a guy having a bad day at work, and he starts obsessively reviewing what happened at this meeting, which I can relate to from my own work-related PTSD. And then he goes home and he starts to be suspicious. And he's in a future in which everyone is constantly recording their experiences, what they see and what they hear with a thing, and then they can just easily rewind it. I don't know whatever search function they have, and they must have an advanced LLM in there, but they easily find any experience that they need to. When he goes through TSA, they rewind the last 2 days of his life just to go through it, which you're worried about coming back into the United States anytime soon. You may relate to that scenario, that people are going to be scrolling through everything that you've done for the last 2 days. But when he gets home, he becomes suspicious that his wife has had an affair, and eventually he forces he obsessively goes back through his memories of their interaction with this person. He forces his wife to show her memories, and then he forces the guy to show his memories. So the kind of privacy, the obsession that could come with life logging. Now, life logging has been, I have 2 terabytes of videos and photos of my family. I give my kids periodically updated versions of our family records. I don't think they've ever opened it. They never remember that they had a previous version when I give it to them. So the idea that people are going to become obsessive by rewatching, family memories or death bots, as Nir and I've argued about, seems a little far-fetched to me. But in this particular case, I can definitely understand obsessively rewatching a bad work instance or being suspicious about infidelity. But I think that this, again, expresses our general concern about not just BCIs like this, but about the growing amount of digital exhaust that we create, and how that we don't necessarily have control over it, and how it could violate our rights by having other people have access to it. The idea that reliance on external objects, that Socrates famously complained that young people today don't know how to memorize anything because they learned how to read, and now they can just read it instead of keep it in the brain. I think since then, we've had the problem of the more that we learn to do that, the less that we keep stuff in our head. And with LLMs, it's become especially concerning because the things that LLMs can do for us and our students are some of the key things that we want students to be learning: the cognitive critical skills, how to write, how to analyze data. And so this idea of cognitive offloading as a form of e-brain damage, that the more we have access to these affordances, the more we're going to have damage. I think one of the examples of this would be Johnny Mnemonic, a short story from William Gibson, who more famously invented the Neuromancer universe and the idea of cyberspace. But in Johnny Mnemonic, a short story of his that was turned into Keanu Reeves' movie, he's a data courier and he has a BCI in his brain, but it also encodes some of his own personal memories. And so when he has a big load to load, he has to decide to erase parts of his own personal memories in his brain. It's a very tangible form of cognitive offloading and e-brain damage, I think. But we see this, I see this as an expression of a kind of general anxiety that our reliance on technology may be making us dumber. Elysium isn't about brain-computer interfaces, but it's a future in which the rich have all absconded to orbital habitats where they have perfect medicine, functional immortality, nanotech, and people who still are on the planet live horrible proletarian lives. And it's a revolutionary text where eventually a guy gets a hold of the right brain-computer interface, the exoskeleton, and launches war against the heaven. And the question, I think, there is, how expensive are these things going to be? Right now, the idea that the rich people in the United States are chomping at the bit to have brain surgery to put these things in, which may only last 2 years and give them the ability to type out, 1 word a minute on a touch screen. It's not, doesn't make any sense. But eventually, when we get to brain-computer interfaces, perhaps non-invasive, perhaps invasive, but easily flushable or turn-offable or something like that, these will be more attractive to the wealthy, and that there would be a divide in who could afford which kinds of services or who couldn't. And that kind of pricing we already see affecting the world in terms of the digital divide and cognitive divide. You can't read it here, but this is the pricing scheme. Most recent pricing scheme from ChatGPT, where they have a free tier, they have a plus tier for $20 a month, and then they have the pro tier for $200 a month. And the pro tier is supposed to be where they'll be rolling out these agentic functions where you're basically hiring a separate worker to do work for you that would learn all the things that you do. So an example of the kind of cognitive divide that we already see in our society, and that I think people are quite rightly concerned about, things like brain-computer interfaces being another place where this might occur. 77% of Americans, when asked by Pew, said that they thought that the rich would have access to BCIs before everybody else. Corporate exploitation. This episode, the most recent season of Black Mirror, which people think it's gotten back on track, and I'm actually enjoying it. But this first episode of Black Mirror from this most recent season is called Common People. And Rashida Jones has a stroke. She has a tumor. And when they take out the tumor, she's left permanently unconscious. And a company comes along and says, look, we can put in a BCI and it will wake her back up. And she'll be just like, and the husband says, okay, how much is it? $300. So the catch is that, the initial catch is that she's on a service plan. If she doesn't pay the $300 a month, she goes back unconscious and potentially dead. If she leaves the service area plan, because it's a high bandwidth service thing, if she leaves the service area plan, she immediately goes unconscious and could die. And then because the entry tier that she's in becomes an entry tier, and then there are subsequent tiers, they start introducing things in the entry tier. This is what Cory Doctorow calls enshittification. They start introducing things that they didn't tell her about in the first place. So she suddenly starts spouting advertisements in the middle of ordinary conversations that are situationally triggered by the algorithm. During lovemaking, she starts talking to her husband about the joys of a particular brand of lube, to her kids when she's talking to her preschool kids, because she's a school teacher. She suddenly recommends Christian counseling because they bought an ad in her brain. And when she discovers that this is happening, she loses her job, and then she discovers that this is happening when she's horrified. But to get out of that, she has to pay $800 a month for the premium tier. And then there's a tier even above that, and the tier above that is where you get things like parkour skills or super math abilities or super art abilities, so the enhancement tier. And so this kind of tierification that we already see in terms of our access to high bandwidth services in the world already affects us, and that's what this episode is directly referencing. It also has things like BCI sliders for mood. So when this episode finally comes to a close, you see people shifting their nonchalance or their sublimity, their serenity up and down, which I would love to have. But that particular feature I would find much better than clorazepam or lorazepam. Okay, matrix of manipulation. I don't know if you remember, but in RoboCop, one of the themes is that there's a little nubbin of brain left in RoboCop. He was a human cop, and then he was cyborgized. And that the part of the tension of the RoboCop series is that the corporate fascist oligarchs who control him want him to do terrible things, and his little nubbin of humanness in there wants to not do those things. He has some memories of his family and his life. And so there's this kind of question of how much the corporate influences will overwhelm the humanity. So the matrix of manipulation in there. And of course, the matrix itself is an example of people living in complete manipulation. The hypothetical there is that they're somehow useful to the computers. I don't know why they would ever be useful in that particular way. It's almost an optimistic scenario to think that computers would find it useful as an energy source. But the matrix is manipulating us for its own purposes. But perhaps a more subtle example is the Black Mirror episode Men Against Fire, in which soldiers with implants see their enemies as monsters. And in this particular scene here, this is from behind, so they're actually, you see that they're human, but when the soldier sees them, he sees them as completely monstrous. And this kind of subtle manipulation in a military context, people have worried about this with, for instance, the suppression, the use of propranolol by soldiers would suppress PTSD symptoms and then make them more likely to be violent in a second or third encounter. And so people worry about this kind of manipulation of soldiers' abilities and ethical discomforts. But we're already worried about that. We're already worried about living in a world controlled by algorithms and not knowing whether these algorithms, how these algorithms are trying to manipulate us in various ways. This study found that TikTok use predicts positive use of China's human rights record, given the fact that 500,000 TikTok refugees tried to learn Chinese to get in Douyin and RedNote. It seems like there may be some other political things happening that cause that other than TikTok manipulation, but I think there is some evidence that TikTok, for instance, suppresses news about Uyghurs and therefore is subtly manipulating us. And Neil Asher is not the most popular science fiction author. I find his, and he's politically incorrect out the wazoo. So I can't read anything that he's written that's not set at least 2,000 years in the future. But 2,000 years in the future, he imagines things like a guy wakes up with an artificial intelligence, BCI, in his brain, and there's a struggle within him about whether to incorporate this personality or whether it's a separate personality that's trying to take him over. And he then has control over the BCIs of his soldiers and his army, and he decides to force them all to have loyalty to the cause, but he tells them that he's doing it. And he says, look, I'm forcing you to be loyal, but when this battle's over, I'll take that away and you can choose. And after he takes it away, some of the soldiers say, you know what? I liked having a purpose in life better than being the nihilistic person or mercenary I was before. And so I'll stick with this, right? And so I think it raises some really interesting questions about the limits of AI selfing, how we will relate to potential personalities that we have intimate access to through BCIs that we already, the agency debate right now, AI agents, we may relate to them externally as separate people. What if they're actually communicating through our BCI and they're part of our personality? I think these are some really interesting questions that are being addressed in science fiction as well. And then the final stage of that would be identity blurring, and the Borg being a classic example. When I asked ChatGPT for good examples of this, they said, well, the Borg is so far futuristic that you don't even need to talk about that one. I'm like, no, it's okay, I'll talk about that one. But the Borg is, of course, an example where you get assimilated and all of your personality is subsumed. But for me, as a sociologist, I've always thought that there's so many ways that we already subsume our identities through various kinds of practices to groups, that all the groups that we participate in have things that we can participate in that subscribe our autonomy and our sense of self, to the point where people like Durkheim said, well, some people commit suicide because they're too much a part of groups, just absorbed into groups. And so for me, I see the beginning of this kind of identity blurring all around me. But BCI has definitely proposed the possibility of a more complete erasure of individual identity. So let's see, I can't read. So I'm basically saying that technology, oh, this is a quote from Ted Chiang. He says, our fears and anxieties about technology are best understood as fears or anxiety about how capitalism will use technology against us. And technology and capitalism have been so closely intertwined that it's hard to distinguish the two. So what I'm trying to say with this brief discursus on popular culture is that even though we've been talking about BCIs in popular culture for a long time, science fiction is always about the present. It's about our anxieties about the present. And from this extended mind perspective, it's okay that we talk about both our current anxieties about algorithms, loss of identity, exploitation, manipulation, as well as what could happen with BCIs, because the two are intimately related. We are moving our external affordances potentially into our brains with these technologies. And that's my thought. So thank you so much.